Our lives are linked as never before, connected every day in 1,000 unseen ways. We are a tapestry of humanity, where each individual thread plays a part. But there are dangers in our midst. Diseases largely unseen for a generation are returning.
Measles is something you associate with kiddies, preschool. You don't associate it with teenagers and 20-year-olds.
Across the world, children are getting sick and dying as nervous parents skip their children's shots.
In a matter of 10 hours, she went from playing to dying in my arms. It was that quick.
If you start to decrease vaccine immunization rates, what you start to see is the diseases reemerge.
One result could be a veritable tsunami of disease.
And yet there are cases of rare and serious vaccine reactions that damage lives and fragile public trust.
They basically said, "We're sorry, but your son has some kind of paralysis, and we just simply don't know why."
It's like living with a ticking time bomb. 1 minute he can be laughing, next minute he's having a 2-hour seizure on the floor.
How do we decide whether to vaccinate or not? And what are the real risks?
I think the key is communication and honesty, and I think the medical community has to put the cards on the table.
It's not about saying, oh my gosh, I'm afraid, and now that's the end of the conversation. No, that's just the start of the conversation.
In Australia, like much of the developed world, vaccination is widely accepted. Here, over 90% of people support vaccination. Only around 2% are opposed. But in 2012, an Australian survey revealed something surprising. Over 50% of parents have concerns around vaccines. Some are more worried about vaccines than the diseases the vaccines prevent. Until recently, Jumana and Billy Chandab were enjoying everyday family life. Then someone, somewhere, passed a dangerous germ to Osman, their newborn son. And suddenly, life went terribly wrong. Osman Chandab is 7 weeks old. He was due to be vaccinated against whooping cough in the next week. But the germ has got to him first. His mother, Jumana, brought him to hospital 2 days ago. What started as a runny nose and a slight cough has become frightening episodes where he's struggling to breathe.
He's got some pneumonia, so we're doing antibiotics.
Whooping cough, or pertussis as it's formally known, can be life-threatening for babies. 1 in 4 babies hospitalised have serious complications, like pneumonia. 1 in 250 die. There's no medical cure. Antibiotics are used to reduce the chance of infecting others. But Osman's tiny body must fight the infection.
Whooping cough is caused by a really nasty bacteria called Bordetella pertussis, and that produces a toxin and it attacks the airways and causes a really nasty bronchitis. And they get really sticky, thick phlegm that they can't shift. And that they try to, and that causes them to cough. And the cough needs to be really, really vigorous, but it's not very effective, and then sometimes they'll stop breathing. And if they stop breathing for long enough, obviously they can't get the oxygen in, so they go red in the face at first, and then sometimes, if it's an extended period of not breathing, they can go blue, and that can be very, very frightening. They commonly get pneumonia, as this baby has, and that can be quite severe. And that's why he's needing oxygen actually all the time. Sometimes they can get a whole range of complications. The cough is so violent they can have bleeding into the eyes. They can fracture ribs, and sometimes if they have periods of hypoxia, they can develop seizures or even brain damage and even death in rare cases.
Across Australia, whooping cough infections are being reported at the highest levels in over 50 years. In 2011, there were nearly 40,000 cases. And these figures are echoed across the world. Whooping cough is not the only disease reappearing. Measles has also made a comeback. Over 28,000 cases were reported across Europe in 2011. 7,000 people were hospitalized and 9 died. One week ago, 26-year-old Christina Leatherbarrow was a busy nurse working in this hospital. Today, she is a measles patient, running a dangerously high temperature and unable to breathe without assistance. Christina's mother, Elaine, has been visiting her in the isolation ward every day.
Yeah, I thought she'd be a bit more through the disease by now. It seems to be taking longer. She's asthmatic, so it's took hold of her chest a bit as well. That's what's making it longer, I think. Have you still got your back pain? Your kidneys, no, like an infection. It's just because you're dry, isn't it?
Because I'm an academic, I'm on duty for the ward in bursts, and I arrived on the ward having not seen a case of adult measles at all, ever, in my life. And on my first ward round, first day, I saw 3 cases. So I increased my experience of adult measles 3-fold within an hour of walking onto the ward. How are you doing today?
Still feeling a bit nauseous.
Still nauseous. We have seen quite a few patients are struggling with nausea and vomiting. But if I count up right, it's day 6 of the rash?
Yeah.
Keep going. So the rash is quite confluent on your back. Almost you can see the red spots are joining up.
The measles rash is not just an issue on the outside of the body. That same inflammation can be reflected inside, in the lungs and the brain.
Basically what's happening is where the airways are in the lung is inflamed like this. And if you've got asthma, then the smooth muscle will contract, so you're going to get a bit of wheezing there. It seems with measles, you can get involvement of the brain. That means inflammation of the lining of the brain and meningitis, and sometimes an inflammation of the tissue of the brain itself and encephalitis. You can end up with very long-term damage, so well described are children who end up deaf or blind if they survive, or die as a result of that brain involvement.
And surprisingly, it's hitting young adults as well as children.
Cheers. People do think that, in general, you reach your late teens and 20s and you're fit and well, and that's great. The problem is that the immune system by that point is also young and fit, and so when it sees an infectious challenge, it can overreact.
Measles is also highly contagious. Over 90% of people who are exposed and don't have immunity get it.
If we look at the cases who've come in, the vast majority are people who, for some reason, have not been vaccinated. And then, because this is highly infectious, people who don't have protection are now getting affected. In Christina's case, she was not vaccinated because of her asthma, and I think because of her general allergic type, and that's typical for the groups that we've seen.
There's no cure for measles. Most people recover given time, but around 1 in 1,000 have serious complications. Some die.
I guess we all have our biases. Mine is that I work in a hospital. And so, for example, in 1991, in the city of Philadelphia, there was a massive measles epidemic. It actually centered on 2 fundamentalist churches in the city, both of whom chose not to vaccinate their children. As a consequence, about 600 people in those 2 churches got measles. The disease, measles, then spread to the surrounding community. Of the 9 children who died during that 1991 epidemic, 7 of them died in our hospital. So we had to stand by and watch while we tried to support them. And, you know, as doctors, your job is to try and save children's lives. And when you stand helplessly by and watch them die, it gets to you.
And unlikely as it may seem, this man is also a strong supporter of vaccination. Dr. Peter Fisher is clinical director of the largest alternative health centre in Europe. And he's homeopath to Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth.
I think it's very unhelpful to have a polarity between pro and anti-vaccination. I think it is actually unarguable that immunization has saved the lives of many, many millions of people, particularly children, worldwide. And some homeopaths oppose immunization. But they're quite wrong, because the founder of homeopathy, a man called Samuel Hahnemann, wrote very clearly, he said, and I can quote you the exact words, 40 or 50 years ago, when a smallpox epidemic struck a city, half or 3/4 of the children would perish from this wretched pestilence, he called it. The founder of homeopathy was strongly in favor of vaccination. He said it made a huge difference.
As surprising as it may seem, vaccination began as a type of traditional therapy at least 1,000 years ago. In India, when a wave of smallpox approached a town, there are tales of people doing something extraordinary. They were lining up to actually buy the disease. The healers, known as Brahmins, would take a cloth and rub the person's upper arm. Then they would scratch the skin, just enough to draw blood. They would then apply dried smallpox scabs taken from patients who had survived the disease. Most people would get sick, but recover. And from that point on, they were protected. Over 1,000 years ago, the Brahmins had observed one of the basic principles of immunity, that you rarely get infected twice.
You got to give people credit. I mean, they got it right. They knew that there was something going on that protected you. They just had no idea what it was or why.
This early form of inoculation was called variolation. Some say it originally came from Africa. Others believe it began as an ancient form of Chinese medicine, where the powder of dried smallpox scabs was blown up the nose.
We know that as early as 1000 AD, the Chinese were using variolation, using smallpox to prevent smallpox. And they were using some very advanced techniques, actually, what we would now call, you know, techniques that you can recognize in modern virology.
Importantly, they always used a weakened form of the disease.
They would sort of select out the mild cases, and they would collect the lymph and put it in a vial and let it dry out and carry it in their pockets for 2 or 3 weeks. So you've got at least a semi-killed vaccine. You know, the viruses were, if not dead, certainly, you know, moribund.
From the Brahmins in India, we fast forward around 700 years to Europe, where over 400,000 people were dying from smallpox every year. An English mother, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, had only just survived smallpox, and she desperately wanted to protect her children. Whilst in Constantinople, she wrote of seeing a practice unheard of in English medicine.
The old woman comes with a nutshell full of the best sort of smallpox and asks what vein you please to have opened. She immediately rips open that you offer to her, which gives you no more pain than a common scratch, and puts into the vein as much matter as can lie upon the head of her needle.
Like the Brahmins, the local women practiced a form of folk medicine handed down through generations.
The children play together all the rest of the day. Then the fever begins to seize them, and they keep their beds 2 days, very seldom 3. And in 8 days' time, they are as well as before their illness.
Lady Mary inoculated her own son, providing him with something remarkable: immunity.
People knew that if you fought a particular disease and you survived it and you were immune for the rest of your life, that was a good thing. So people tried to figure out how can they essentially simulate that infection without really causing suffering and death, but still inducing the immunity that comes from that.
Lady Mary brought the technique back to England, where it was widely accepted. They didn't understand why it worked, and it was never risk-free. But the death rate with wild smallpox was around 30%. With variolation, it dropped to 2%. Fast forward another 70 years to an English doctor called Edward Jenner, who took the next vital step. He proved that deliberate infection with a mild, non-fatal disease called cowpox would protect against smallpox. He called his technique vaccination, from vacca, Latin for cow.
The one thing Jenner discovered was that vaccinia, cowpox, which is generally a very mild disease in humans, cross-reacts, it prevents smallpox. It was actually his only discovery, an important discovery, but people think that he invented the whole idea, which he didn't.
Edward Jenner's observation caused us to eliminate a disease from the face of the earth, a disease that killed as many as 500 million people. Amazing, right? It was a major breakthrough, a breakthrough that ultimately led to the elimination of the virus from the face of this earth.
But as smallpox disappeared from view, a curious thing happened. Stories began to arise of the dangers of vaccination.
Once Jenner's vaccine was used widely, not surprisingly, people became concerned for the same reason that people are concerned today, which is that adults or children were being inoculated with a biological fluid they didn't understand. They knew that it came from a cow, and that concerned them. There was a famous cartoon by James Gilray in 1804 where he shows a disinterested Edward Jenner sort of standing in the middle of this picture with a big needle in his hand, and around him are people who look worried because they're developing snouts and they're developing floppy ears and they're developing little cows that are sort of coming out from their skin because they are becoming cows. And people, I think, were not sophisticated enough to know that a cowpox virus wouldn't make you become a cow. But that was their fear. You could argue that the same fears are alive today.
And today, there's a powerful new force at play: the internet.
Vaccine concerns are not new. I think the internet is a new force, much bigger than the world anticipated at many levels, and vaccines are part of that bigger picture.
Dr. Heidi Larson is an anthropologist. She studies the reasons why people do, or don't, place trust in vaccines.
If you look at a continuum of people who are very pro-vaccine and people who are very anti-vaccine, there's a large 80+% in the middle who it's either just a social norm, it's what we do, it's good for our children and for our public health. Others that are starting to question, and a certain amount of questioning is healthy. And then there's some that are starting to get more anxious and are vulnerable to tipping into becoming against vaccines if they don't feel like they're getting the right information or are not being heard.
Heidi and her team monitor vaccine concerns across the globe. They are listening to the world's signals, tracking the spread of vaccine-related stories, true or false.
We feel it's really important to be listening, that there isn't just a world polarized between pro and anti-vaccine populations, that those are two extremes like in many disciplines, and that there's a huge group of people who are just asking healthy questions.
Vaccination is risky. It's not just a perception, it is risky, right? We're talking about injecting or swallowing foreign bodies into ourselves and letting our immune systems react to them.
The first step in understanding vaccination is understanding immunity. Sir Gustav Nossel is a superstar of immunology. At 81, he has witnessed and pioneered tremendous insights into how our immune system protects us.
As a little boy, I got both diphtheria and whooping cough because my parents didn't believe in vaccines. That was in the 1930s, so we can forgive them. I was very, very sick with diphtheria. I could easily have died. Now, what we have seen in the industrialized world is essentially all of the major epidemics. They've vanished. Maybe the most dramatic in my lifetime was polio. When I was a little kid, my mum wouldn't let us go to the swimming pool or to the cinema on a Saturday afternoon during a polio epidemic year for fear that we'd catch this terrible infantile paralysis.
Every day we encounter thousands, even millions of germs. Most are harmless, and some are helpful. But there are dangerous ones that need to be stopped.
Immunity is a wonderful natural defense system of the human body. It depends on the white cells of the blood to rapidly get you protected against the disease.
Imagine millions of immune cells, like white blood cells, all on the lookout for specific germs. If they spot something dangerous, like flu, they prepare to fight.
When that flu bug enters your body, the white cells like to move in on it, and they get a bit angry. And in getting angry, they release certain substances that cause inflammation in your body. So you may, in fact, through the immune response alone, feel a little bit uneasy, feel a tiny bit unwell, maybe even develop a tiny spike of fever through the immune response. But that's normal.
The immune cells arm themselves and then replicate, creating an army of clones. Then, launching powerful germ-killing agents called antibodies, they tag the germs for disposal. Once the germ is removed, the immune army disbands. But they leave behind memory cells. Their job is to remember the invader and to sound the alarm if it ever appears again.
One of the most beautiful things is that it's got memory, it remembers. So, if you have measles, say, you'll make a strong immune response against measles. And then, if you and the measles virus were to enter your body a second time, you'll mount a much heightened response. You'll work faster. You'll make better quality antibodies.
The first time around, it can take at least a week to mount the defense. But next time, the system is prepared. The whole process takes barely a day. It's so fast, we may never have time to feel sick.
When we're born, we're not yet very mature in terms of our immune system. So if an infection strikes a little infant, then there's a great vulnerability. There are some aspects of the immune system that aren't mature till the age of 2. Some people believe that you don't need to vaccinate your child because you've got such a beautiful and good immune system. They forget that these bugs that surround us have been co-evolving with us, sometimes for millions of years. And in some respects, they're cleverer than us. They have worked out ways of evading the immune system unless you pre-arm it. So, putting it bluntly, the white cells mightn't be fast enough or smart enough if we hadn't whipped them along by a prior immunization.
A vaccine, in effect, sends in an imposter, a weakened or dead version of the germ, just enough to be recognized. The immune cells mount the defense, and again, you may feel the effect. But because the threat is low, the immune cells quickly disband. However, the all-important memory cells have been created. The immune system is now prepared for the real germ, but without causing full-scale disease. When the majority of a population is vaccinated, most infections won't take hold, and entire communities are protected. But if vaccination rates are too low, communities become vulnerable. For example, because measles is so infectious, you need 95% vaccination coverage. But if, say, it drops to 89%, like in France, the impact can be dramatic.
I think measles is the best example in terms of a current example of inadequate immunization coverage and the consequences of it. It's a combination of people's risk tolerance is low and yet a distorted notion of how invulnerable they are, that they would never get certain diseases. And if they did, they'd be fine.
By 2012, the measles outbreak reached the Ukraine. There were over 10,000 cases by the middle of the year. Right at the time, 1 million football supporters were heading into the region for the European Football Championship. But as fans poured into the city of Lviv, few had any idea they were heading into a measles-infected area.
At our time, there was no vaccination against measles. I think I'm not vaccinated against measles. I had it when I was a child.
I didn't hear nothing about it. It was kind of crazy to come in here. I never thought I would come here, but...
The measles virus can spread in a sneeze, a cough, or a touch. It can also hang in the air and linger on objects for hours. And importantly, people can be spreading disease days before showing any signs of illness. The virus is taking hold here in the Lviv area because the measles vaccination rate is extremely low, at around 40%. By the end of 2012, there were over 12,000 cases across the Ukraine. The outbreak was fueled by a range of issues, including a shortage of vaccines, waning immunity, and a deep mistrust of vaccination. Mistrust amplified by stories on the internet.
If you want to talk about vaccination, you have to talk about the stories that we can see online or we can see in the news, right? We tell stories about what we know or what we've seen. So the stories that circulate, go viral, are the stories that have that emotional power. And what's the most emotional story? The story of some child being hurt.
Okay, so on Saturday...
I'll go see.
Listen to Mummy. Watch Mummy. He's on Saturday. Saturday is...
Sam Jackson and her husband have an unusual dilemma around vaccinating their son, Luke.
The animals, isn't it? Walk, good boy, then...
At 6 years of age, he's had over 500 seizures.
Good boy, very good boy.
Seizures that have left him brain damaged and vulnerable.
If he's less anxious, he's less likely to have a seizure. You know, we've found that's quite important if he knows what's coming next. So, yeah. It's a bit like having a baby and a toddler still. He's 6.5, but in many respects he's like a toddler. He's divine. He's the light of our lives and absolute joy. To look after him is very high maintenance, though. We have to watch him all the time. We have cameras on his bed. We have to follow him wherever he goes. So, yeah, it's quite full on.
Luke was born a healthy, happy, normal baby.
Yeah, I mean, he was actually quite remarkable. We could turn pages in the book and things like this at sort of 4 or 5 months. And, yeah, he looked he did look sort of wise in his way, you know.
When Luke was 6 months of age, Sam took him in for his routine vaccinations. 17 hours later, she noticed something odd.
He had this really strange smile on his face. And then I noticed his left arm twitching, his left hand, and his left arm was just straight out and just sort of twitching like that. And that, you know, didn't look right. He went into this full, violent, that's the only word I can use to describe it, convulsion. He was frothing at the mouth. He was just completely shaking, and then I was like beside myself. I didn't know what to do. I rang the ambulance, and just as they entered the house, he just stopped and went completely lifeless and turned blue. And I sort of had this out-of-body experience, I suppose. And I kind of hovered on the roof, you know, and I was looking down and I didn't know what to do. Anyway, the paramedics came in and they gave him some oxygen, and they said we need to take him to hospital right now.
The doctors explained that the vaccine had caused a fever, which had triggered Luke's seizure.
The febrile seizures are fairly common, you know.
That age group, you know, for that age group.
Take him home, don't worry about it. He'll be absolutely fine. And then I think it would have been
10 days later.
10 days later, and I got another call at work from Sam, and he'd had another seizure. So, and that was when it really sort of dawned on us, I think, that something really serious was going on.
I went to the internet and I was searching everywhere. I was looking at books that were pro-vaccine, books that were anti-vaccine, just to find similar stories, and Googling, a lot of Googling. I was convinced it was the vaccine. So, yeah, we did really think they'd been the cause.
For that 6-month period, as far as we were concerned, it was vaccine-related, because it was obvious to us. They'd had the thing 17 hours before he had the first fit, and now he's broken. I don't know. You know, it's just something has caused this, and the only thing it can possibly be is this vaccine. Blaming ourselves up to that point, really. You know, why did we do this? It was stupid. We hadn't done this, he'd be fine.
At the time, I remember thinking too, why Luke? You know, we had friends that had children the same age who'd had all their vaccines. We had family, and it was only Luke, and we just couldn't work out why.
After many months of searching the world for answers, they discovered the clues to Luke's illness lay on the other side of Melbourne. Professor Ingrid Scheffer leads a team of Australian neuroscientists studying rare cases like Luke's. Cases where prolonged seizures happen soon after vaccination.
Can you see the kangaroo?
There's the kangaroo. There's Ingrid.
Hello, Lukey. Oh, that's beautiful. Did you do that?
Just be
What
careful.
are you doing? You're hiding with Marty, are
I'm
you?
hoping he's not going to...
Oh, do you know what it is? He's fascinated with watching people sit down.
It's really important that it occurred so close to his vaccination, and this is really what led to the thinking that there was a vaccine encephalopathy. And I say so-called because everyone associated that the timing of the vaccination and the timing of the first seizure meant that the vaccine was causative.
You're a perfect boy.
For 6 years, Ingrid's team studied the patients carefully. They noticed that the histories and symptoms matched those of a rare form of epilepsy called Dravet syndrome.
Dravet syndrome is a very severe epilepsy beginning in infancy.
and it occurs in a previously normal and well baby. And then by about 12 months of age, they start to develop other types of seizures. A host of different seizure types can occur. And their development slowly slows down. So they have normal development, and then between 1 to 2 years of age, it sort of plateaus. And by far, the majority of children with Dravet syndrome have intellectual disability.
Dravet syndrome is caused by a mutation in a particular gene called the SCN1A gene. And this impacts key pathways in the brain. This is usually a new mutation, not something passed on from the child's parents. In 2006, the team made a key discovery. The majority of the children who had prolonged seizures after vaccination also had the gene for Dravet syndrome.
The gene, the SCN1A mutation, is the cause of the Dravet syndrome, and the vaccine is at most a trigger for a seizure. And anybody with epilepsy has triggers for their seizures. They're not causative, they're triggers. So you can have genes causing your epilepsy, but triggers are commonly sleep deprivation, stress, and in this situation, vaccination is a trigger.
When Luke was tested, they discovered he too had the gene mutation. He had Dravet syndrome.
On the one hand, we knew what it was. We knew that he had a gene mutation, it wasn't going away, it was for life. But on the other hand, we realised it wasn't anything we'd done.
Basically said to us it wasn't your fault, you know, and that was...
yeah, that was huge. The families, I know, their child, adult now, is 21, just found out. So it's 21 years of thinking that it was the vaccine and why, you know, thinking, oh, what did I do?
Good boy.
Today, Sam and Tom know that any fever can trigger Luke's seizures, whether a fever from a toothache or from a vaccine. They also understand that Luke was going to get this condition anyway.
I have no doubt in my head that he would have had his first seizure with or without the vaccine. We've chosen not to vaccinate him further because we know it was a trigger.
You know.
We avoid, you know, taking him outside on really hot days. He has seizures when he comes off a trampoline. So we avoid known triggers.
The decision not to vaccinate Luke has been a hard one, for a fever from a disease like measles could kill him. So he's vulnerable if they do, and perhaps even more vulnerable if they don't.
Good night, Papa.
We rely on other people having their kids vaccinated to protect Luke, so we can't vaccinate him because of the reaction that he could potentially have to, you know, to the fever that might be that might come along with that. So we rely on other people.
Cases like Luke's are extremely rare. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. And yet his story is revealing a deeper understanding of the complex interplay between genes and vaccines. David Salomon's childhood story is also extremely rare. And his changed the course of vaccination history.
I contracted polio from the vaccination. It affected my right leg. My muscles atrophied. I wear a leg brace. My right foot's smaller than my left foot.
At 22, this is the first time David has spoken publicly of his family's epic journey.
No, I'm one in the million in the sense that I contracted polio from the vaccination, but I'm also one in the million that I was born into the family that I was born into.
When he was 6 months old, his parents, John and Kathy, took him for his routine vaccinations, including the oral polio vaccine. Within 24 hours, David had a fever and a rash.
So we took him to the pediatrician, and he basically said, oh, it's nothing. You know, I mean, just, you know, probably a little reaction, but don't worry about it. And,
high fever.
Yeah, you know, and so it just seemed to get worse, and then suddenly we noticed that he wasn't even able to move his extremities, lower extremities. We gave up on the pediatrician and immediately took him to Children's Hospital. And after a week, they basically said, you know, we're sorry, but your son has some kind of paralysis, and we don't know why. We just simply don't know why. We went home and, you know, cried our eyes out, and not knowing really at that point that there was a direct relationship with the vaccine, because we had been assured that, oh no, you know, nothing to do with the vaccine.
For the first few years, David needed ongoing physical therapy. He was sick a great deal.
It was strange because he would get sick, and then the doctors would give him antibiotics, and then he'd seem to be better, and then he'd get sick again. I didn't know what to think.
By age 3, after endless tests, one doctor connected the dots.
He came back to us and he basically said, well, you know, your son has a genetic disorder. He was born without half of his immune system, which, by the way, in retrospect, could explain why he kept getting sick and the doctor kept putting him on antibiotics.
David was diagnosed with an immune disorder known as Bruton's disease, which means his body can't produce antibodies. So when a germ enters his system, he has no way to mount a defense.
No one knew at the time that he had a compromised immune system, so when he was given the live polio vaccine, we effectively gave him polio that day that we took him into the doctor's office for his vaccination.
To understand how this could happen, we need to revisit the extraordinary but troubled history of the polio vaccine. This unusual-looking contraption is an iron lung, a relic from the 1950s polio epidemic in the United States. In 1952 alone, 58,000 Americans were affected.
In the 1940s and 1950s, when polio was king, there would be tens of thousands of children who would be paralyzed every year. There'd be as many as 1,500 children who would die every year. And what made polio so particularly heinous was you never knew who it was going to be. You didn't really understand why it was happening. You didn't understand why some children were paralyzed and others weren't. And so parents became enormously fearful. It was a silent stalker of children. Okay, so it's called an iron lung. Have you ever heard that term, iron lung, before?
How does the machine help your lungs expand?
So it creates a negative pressure. A negative pressure actually causes it to expand. It was a vacuum. That's exactly right. It would create a vacuum, and then it would sort of create a vacuum, and then no vacuum, vacuum, no vacuum. The way that polio would work is it would sort of travel to the spinal cord, and it would damage the spinal cord, so you couldn't, you know, use your muscles to breathe. And if the nerves don't work, you can't breathe.
How long do you have to stand in?
Sometimes it would just be a few days. Sometimes it would be a few weeks. Sometimes children would go into that as children, and they would stay in that for the rest of their lives until they were adults, even elderly adults.
This was my worst nightmare.
Really?
Worst. When I was a kid, I was scared to death that I would be in one.
In the 1950s, millions of Americans donated a dime to help fund the quest to develop a polio vaccine.
In the all-out fight against polio, led by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, there were many years of struggle and heartbreak.
It was an extraordinary alliance of scientists and volunteers, moving step by step closer to a viable vaccine. Then, in 1955, came the announcement that changed history.
A major medical hurdle was crossed with the discovery by Dr. Jonas Salk of the anti-polio vaccine, which was to spread a mantle of protection over millions of American children.
They had developed a vaccine that could prevent polio.
Finally, the climax of production, inactivation. The power of the polio virus to infect man will be utterly destroyed. The enemy of man is now ready to become his servant.
It just tore through this country and this world that now we had a way to prevent polio. It was, I think, the single most dramatic moment of vaccine development because people were so scared.
Unfortunately, the euphoria didn't last. 14 days later, public health officials recalled the polio vaccine. One of the laboratories, the Qatar laboratory, had made the vaccine badly. The virus that was supposed to be dead was still alive.
As a consequence About 120,000 children were inadvertently inoculated with live, deadly polio virus. 200 were permanently paralyzed, and 10 were killed. It's, I think, probably the worst biological disaster in our country's history, arguably in any country's history.
It became known as the Qatar incident. The Surgeon General announced that in the public interest, the polio vaccine was suspended. And new testing procedures were introduced to prevent such a disaster happening again.
But the lesson that was learned from that was that we needed to regulate vaccines far more carefully, far more tightly. And so it really was the birth of the vaccine regulation in the United States.
Polio epidemics continued to sweep across the United States. But those who had received the correctly made vaccine were protected, and so the rollout restarted. In the 1960s, a second vaccine was introduced, called the Sabin vaccine. It was an oral vaccine, often delivered on a sugar cube. It became the vaccine of choice, as it was easy and cheap to administer. Together, the two vaccines saw polio cases plummet by more than 99%. However, the oral vaccine had one drawback. It used a weakened but live form of the virus. There was a tiny risk it could mutate, becoming dangerous again. A risk of 1 in 2.4 million doses. By the 1990s, the only cases of polio in the United States were those caused by the oral vaccine itself.
Okay, David, come on down.
Cases like David Salomon.
Come on down on the sidewalk. I want to show you something.
No doctor that we saw had ever, in their entire lives, seen a case of polio.
Okay,
Who would ever think, you'd have a child who would get polio today?
Using his skill as a journalist and a lobbyist, John wanted the oral polio vaccine replaced with the injectable version. 10 other countries had already done so.
Well, the media was a critical part of the whole campaign. They got comfortable. They got entrenched in a schedule that worked. They saw numbers. They didn't see faces. When we went to Atlanta, they saw faces.
I'm not against vaccinations. I'm pro-vaccinations. We had thousands of people contracting polio prior to the vaccination. We came out with the vaccination, and that number decreased significantly. So less people are getting sick, less people are getting affected, and that's a good thing, regardless of any way you look at it.
Then Abigail began to complain of a headache. As evening fell, she was vomiting and running a fever.
I called the hospital. I talked to a nurse, and she said, there's a vomiting flu going around. Just keep her fever down the best that you can. About 5:30 or so in the morning, she called for Daddy, and Dwayne went running to her, and he says, Shannon, you need to come see Abigail. She has purple blotches all over her legs. And I went into the bathroom, and I couldn't. She had huge blotches, like bruises on her legs, which I now know is sepsis. And I didn't know it then. And so he said, we better take her to the emergency room. We need to get into the hospital right away.
The nearest hospital was almost an hour away.
So we all got in the car. I sat in the back, and I sat between the two children. And Abby was in her car seat, but resting towards me, and I was trying to hold her. It seemed like forever to get there. And as I was holding Abigail in my arms, she said to me, Mommy, I hurt all over. And I said, I know, honey. It's a sickness. We're trying to do all we can. We're getting you to the hospital as fast as we can. But I truly felt as if God had taken her. I just really felt that she left. And she kind of became limp in my arms. On the way to the hospital.
In the early hours of the morning, Abigail was pronounced dead.
In a matter of 10 hours, she went from playing to dying in my arms. It was that quick.
Unbelievably, things were about to get even worse.
When we finally left, we came back to the farm, and there were so many people here. And then Samuel started to vomit. He had the same stuff that she had. He didn't have the purple blotches, but he was coughing and vomiting, and his fever was going up. So my sister and I put him in the car, and we went back to the hospital, and they got him in right away.
Sam was in intensive care for 2 days. He left hospital just in time to be at the funeral of his big sister. Sam and Abigail had contracted pneumococcal disease. This is a broad term that includes serious diseases like meningitis and pneumonia. It kills over 1 million people every year. 2 children die every hour in the Americas alone. And it's the #1 vaccine-preventable disease in the world.
Both Ab and Sam were fully vaccinated with the required vaccinations. In the state of Minnesota, pneumococcal and varicella were not required, and so they did not have those vaccines. I asked our pediatrician at their well check for the varicella vaccine for chickenpox. They had not had chickenpox yet, and he talked me out of it. He said, chickenpox is such a mild sickness, let them get it. He even encouraged me to expose them to children that had it.
The doctor didn't recommend the pneumococcal vaccine either.
He felt that they were healthy children and that they would be all right without the vaccine. I was discouraged, definitely discouraged, because I wanted the vaccine for my children. I should have insisted, but at the time didn't know enough.
Give me that other one. Over there. Yellow one.
There is an unexpected layer to this story. An autopsy later revealed that Abigail had no spleen, which meant her immune system was unable to fight the infection fast enough. Abigail needed the vaccine more than most. And ideally, she needed the people around her being free of the infection.
I want parents to know, people to know, that disease kills, and it will take your child, and you don't know if your child is compromised or not. I mean, we're a typical family in Minnesota, and we didn't know. Or we would have done everything in our power to make sure that she would have survived.
As is true with many diseases, we don't know when we've been exposed. There's 2 things that matter for whether or not I'm going to get sick. One is, if I bump into somebody who has the disease am I protected against it or not? That's the way we often think about vaccines, right? It will protect me if I happen to be exposed. But the other piece, and the more important piece, is the chance I will bump into somebody in the first place, whether I will ever interact with someone who has this disease.
When a disease is in circulation, sometimes it's not obvious. It can be present and spreading quietly, carried by people who may be unaware they are infected. If the vaccination rates are low, it's not a question of if there will be people infected, but rather how many and how badly.
The more people around me who are protected, the less likely I am to bump into somebody who actually has the disease. And you can think of this as these sort of concentric circles of people. And the less the disease exists in my circle or the next circle or the next circle, the safer I am. Now, I can't control what other people do, but what I do doesn't just affect me. The same set of circles exists for everybody. So the only way to be truly certain that we will not get sick is to have all of the circles, from my family to my community to my country to the world, such that there is no disease. We've done it once with smallpox. All of our lives is surrounded by the risks of everyday life. I mean, I walk across the street. I could trip. I could be hit by a car. Risk is an emotion. It's how we feel. I feel at risk. Something bad might happen to me, and I don't want it to happen to me, and I'm really scared of it. My daughter is 13 now. She's an avid tap dancer, and so I, as a parent, had to think about, is she old enough to manage the risks that come with getting on a bus by herself, going across town, dealing with whoever she might meet. Now, is that perfectly safe? And when I say that, I mean nothing bad could ever happen to her? Of course not. But we chose to take on those risks because the benefits were clear. She got to grow as a person. She got to practice her dance. She got to experience life.
The vaccine story is, in many ways, a coming-of-age story. As we graduate from ancient techniques and limited understanding to exploring a new generation of vaccines against the modern plagues like cancer, diabetes, and dementia. And as we ponder where we may yet travel, it's worth remembering where we've been.
In 1955, this is where Dr. Thomas Francis announced to the world that the outcome of the polio vaccine trials, and he told the world that the vaccine was safe, effective, and potent. I love having this conversation here in this room because what we really need to do is to get back into the mindset, in one sense, of the people who were sitting here in 1955. They looked at the vaccine trials and said, is this a better choice? Not a perfect choice, a better choice than what we face if we do not vaccinate. And then we must ask the other half of the question. What will happen if we do not do this? What will our lives be like if we do not take the choice to be vaccinated? And to come to grips with the reality that the less often we vaccinate, the more our lives will be touched, perhaps slowly at first, but eventually more and more, by diseases that we once thought were gone.
Back in the Ukraine, this football game is over. The thousands that came here, many just for a day, now scatter across Europe and the world. Few are aware that they have been in the midst of a measles epidemic, or that they may be taking the disease home with them.
As long as the disease exists somewhere in our community, we are all at risk. Even those of us who vaccinate are at risk, because vaccines are not perfect. They are not going to protect everyone. As long as that disease exists, there is a value to vaccinating.
We're all in this together. We all inhabit this planet together. We all make decisions that affect not only us but others. And I would like to believe that there is something in us that allows us to see it that way.
There's no doubt that many, many children have died in developed countries. Well-nourished, well-cared-for children have died, and the history on that is very clear. So perhaps to remember history is one of the most important messages.
Vaccines have delivered a remarkable, but often invisible gift. Because the ordinary stories of so many millions of us who are alive and well, untouched by disease or vaccine reactions, are rarely told.
We all want to have a vaccine and the kid is fine. And then the kid goes out in the world and the kid never gets sick. That's the story we all want. But we never see that story.
Stars live in the sky. You'll see them shining bright. You'll wonder why. Carl Sagan said we are made from matter like the sun. The universe in all its beauty transformed into one. You are the one I love. You are the one I love. Whenever I am lonely, it is you I'm thinking of. You are the one I love.